It was so great with Ben Johnson, because Ben Johnson, he wasn't a great dialogue actor, I mean, he'd always forget his lines. Put him on a horse, he knew everything. He would be point man or scouting a location. He said, all the Indians came through here. And how do you know that? And Ben would forget his lines. He said, creek's all muddied up,
Hi, I'm Rob Word. Welcome to another edition of A Word on Westerns, and today we are going way back, which is always fun. Going to talk about the greatest Western and movie director pretty much of all time. There's a lot of agreement to that. His name, John Ford. And our guest today is a man who wrote a book about it called Pappy, and that book was written because he's the grandson of John Ford. Let's hear it for Dan Ford.
Well,
Dan, welcome. Good to see you here at the Archery Museum.
Oh, nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
I hear all these stories all the time about what a son of a bitch your grandfather was.
He was old school. He was hardcore.
Mm-hmm.
He was tough on the men, easy on the women. He was what you would call task-oriented today. He got it done. He kicked ass, but he wasn't as bad as Cecil B. DeMille.
Well, he was a much better director, too.
Well, true. He was also a better man. He was tough, but he had a very gentle side that not many people saw. Very tender side, only those that were close to him.
Well, you and your brother growing up, and he's your pappy, your grandfather, he must have been adorable to you two.
Well, he was good to us, but he was always gone. I don't think he ever accepted an Academy Award. He was either, off on location. I remember Duke took his award for The Quiet Man because he was in Africa making Magombo. He was always working. The only time we really got to spend much time with him was on his boat on the Erin. Yeah, and those were great.
That was his getaway place.
Yeah, that was his getaway. That was his special place, And it was its most expensive vice, maintaining a big boat like that.
Well, those were day trips, were they? You would go out for several days?
Well, yeah, we would. We did, and actually, he would park it over in Catalina during the summer, zip back and forth either on the water taxi or on one of the speedboats, and come over on the weekends, even if he was working. So that was pretty much the summer.
And you would sail over there with him or fly him?
Sail over there or fly over. We didn't fly much. We took the water taxis mostly,
I heard holidays with him were always nice, though, too.
Oh, yeah. Sure.
Did you ever go on location to any of the films?
No, he didn't want family around unless you were working for him. He didn't want his wife there. He didn't want distractions. He discouraged cast members from bringing wives and whatever. And also most of the locations he worked at, like Monument Valley, there just weren't the accommodations. Goulding's Lodge, only the top tier above the line got an actual room with a running water. Everybody else was in a tent,
And your book, Pappy, which exposed more about him and told more about him, my understanding is he always made up stuff, fabricated his history, and it changed.
It was a great bullshit. I mean, everything was bullshit, But yeah, if you ask him what day it is, if it was Tuesday, he'd say it's Thursday. I mean, he was a contrarian that way.
When you were writing the book, he had already passed.
Well, I started when he was alive. I started interviewing him down in Palm Desert and collecting his papers. Now, if I had to do it all over again, I would have just collected the papers and done the interviews because I had access to people like Hank Fonda and Jimmy Stewart and the Duke that a lot of people wouldn't have. And I would have turned that over to a, quote, real writer, unquote, and either done it with or done the research. My main accomplishment, I feel, was collecting his papers because my father and my Aunt Barbara, they didn't really understand the value of it, or they didn't want to be involved in it. They were just done. I collected everything and got it to the Lilly Library at Indiana University, and so everything's there is together. And when somebody was writing a master's thesis on Dudley Nichols, I said, call the Lilly, You have my permission.
Well, when you were collecting those papers, were they all at his home?
They were scattered. They were mostly a lot of them were at his home. Yeah, a lot of them were at his home. A lot of them were in his garage. A lot of them were there was a steamer trunk full of stuff from the 1920s.
What did he think of you writing a book about him?
Well, I think I don't know what he thought about the writing. I think he thought it was a good idea that we document everything that we could. You didn't get a lot out of him. You didn't get a lot of straight talk out of him. You got straight talk out of everybody else. You got there was George O'Brien, Lefty Huff, John Wayne. Those were the key contributors, and a few others.
Well, George O'Brien had been plucked out of almost obscurity to do the Irons.
A cameraman.
What kind of stories did he have about?
Well, George, you asked George what time it was. He'd tell you how to make a watch, he couldn't say a complete contrite sentence, he'd just go on and on and on. But he really knew John Ford. He was a good friend of Ford's. And they had gone on a trip to the Philippines in the 1930s. And they took a tramp steamer and spent a lot of time over there, and they went to Indonesia, and they went to Bali and everything, and so they were very close. George and my grandfather evidently had a fight. My grandfather went on a drunk in Manila, apparently, and not the first time, and George left him, and that he could make an enemy. He would put something in his filing cabinet in the back of his brain and say, you did this to me, and he wouldn't forget it. And he didn't use George O'Brien again until after the war. Now, George O'Brien wasn't a great actor. He was very good in silence because he had a great look. But then when he got older, he was very good character. He was a very good character actor, playing the major, the colonel, in the Cavalry trilogy, and so on. And he was a very competent actor. His son Darcy O'Brien wrote a wonderful book about him, and was kind of negative. My grandfather used to say the O'Brien family, George, they skipped a generation because his father had been the chief of police in San Francisco. Then there was George, and then there was Darcy. So George. The father had a lot of brains, and there was George who didn't get the brains, and then there's Darcy who had all the brains, So who knows,
Well, he was a pretty big Western star in the 1930s at RKO.
Oh, yeah. He was a fine actor.
He looked great. Chesty O'Brien.
And he was married. Who was he married to? Big name. Anyway, what do I know?
A lot. You know a lot. Well, there was an altercation also that your grandfather had during the making of...
Which one?
Well, let's talk about the Henry Fonda one and Mr. Roberts, too.
Well, Fonda had played Mr. Roberts on Broadway. It was a big hit. He was a big star, and, it was a big success. And Fonda had very definite ideas of where the laughs were and how it should be played, And Ford wanted to make it, he wanted to make it a movie, not a play. He wanted to broaden it out. He wanted to, a little more slapstick humor. He brought in his Ford regulars who were good friends of Fonda's, like Ward Bond and whatever. But he had Ken Curtis, all these guys, he came in, and Fonda didn't like the way it was going. And, it's just one thing led to another, and it turned into a fist fight.
Your grandfather punched Fonda.
Not a good career move.
No.
You don't hit the leading man, you
Never.
You hit the second guy, you hit the tough guy, who could take a punch.
Well, then later on, when you're doing your book, Hank was open with you.
Oh, yeah, he was open with me. And he had, they made up, but they didn't make up. Fonda was a Nebraska wasp. He had a coldness that that John Ford didn't have. He was like Johnny Carson and Henry Fonda, two Nebraska wasps, very much alike. And Ford, New England Irish, very different. So two different personalities, Great actor. I'm not denigrating Henry Fonda. He's a fine actor, fine man.
Well, Ford put him in Young Mr. Lincoln, which I think was the first film they worked together on.
I don't know if it was the first, but it was the first real where it took off. And I think there was a bit of resentment that I know that Fonda, to get the part in The Grapes of Wrath, to get the Tom Joad part, he had to sign a long-term contract with Fox, and he didn't like that. He wanted to get out of Fox. He wanted to, he wanted his freedom. He didn't want to be a studio contract player the rest of his life, and and Zanuck made him sign a 5-year contract to do that, to get that part, which obviously he was perfect for. But maybe there was a residual, resentment carryover from.
Well, at the same time, your grandfather refused to sign with Fox with Daryl Zanuck.
Well, he's had a contract. He had to make 2 or 3 films a year for Fox, but it was a non-exclusive contract, which was fine with Daryl Zanuck because Daryl Zanuck liked Ford to make a certain kind of film. He liked him to make action films. He liked Americana films. And Ford would like to run off to RKO and make films like The Informer, The
Fugitive.
The Fugitive, but it, kind of non-commercial, small, artsy, craftsy films. Mary of Scotland. A lot of these films never made much money, And I think The Informer is the only one that's remembered it in any way.
Well, it was the best actor for Victor McLaglen. And I think your grandfather got best director that year.
He did, and it was they stole that German impressionistic style, all the fog and the cheap sets.
Well, your grandfather kept the same stock company with him, not just the performers, but the camera people too.
Yeah. It started, when you're under contract with Fox, all the crew was pretty much under contract with Fox, to at least the key players, the camera people and the sound people and the production manager. And so they would bring, their people in, and they were all, they went from one Fox film to the next pretty much. And RKO, some of them went over to RKO with them that could. And did, and some didn't,
Well, John Wayne, who out of USC was a prop guy at Fox, and at your grandfather.
Western Avenue Fox, before it was in Westwood.
And then in 1939, after Duke had toiled for 10 years in B films.
But Ford had stayed at France.
And he got out on the boat and done stuff.
I think Wayne liked to get away from his wife and get away like Ford did, and just go off and do guy stuff. That's not allowed anymore. You're not allowed to go out and drink and fish anymore. You're not. That's just
not allowed to do a lot of things that they do. Well, in talking with Duke about his relationship with your grandfather, what did he tell you that you hadn't heard before?
He told me about my grandfather's skill as an editor. He told me he could take all this great Dudley Nichols dialogue, and just scratch, and just find the gem in it. And he said he would have made a great editor. If he hadn't have been in films, he should have been in New York, editing Ernest Hemingway and some of the great writers of his era. And he said he just could, reach into a script and find a nugget. And that's something I didn't know and didn't really appreciate, And he was so great with Ben Jonson, because Ben Jonson, he wasn't a great dialogue actor, he'd always forget his lines. But you could put him on a horse, he knew everything. And, he'd have a line and he would come up and he would he would be point man or scouting a location. He said, all the Indians came through here. And how do you know that? And Ben would forget his lines. He said, creek's all muddied up.
He sure gave Ben an opportunity, though. did something, I guess, rescuing, stopping a terrible wreck with the runaway.
Right. Well, Ben was, he was a rodeo champion, and he grew up on a ranch, and there was nothing on a horse he couldn't do. So, and he did get hauled down a runaway wagon.
Yeah, what was that incident?
I forgot exactly. I think it was on Fort Apache, but it was it was a runaway situation. It was a wagon or a principal on a horse that couldn't handle a horse. I don't remember the details.
Well, he sure gave Ben an opportunity in the Wagon Master, too. But then there was an altercation, I think, that took place in Rio Grande.
And one of them, it was, it was an altercation between Ben and Duke. And Ford stepped in, and I don't know exactly. I can't recall exactly what happened. It was something about we shot so many Indians a day. He said, yeah, but not too many of them fell, or something. I don't know exactly.
That sounds about right.
But yeah.
Well, in his relationship that he had as a mentor
and after that, Ben didn't work with John Ford.
Not until Cheyenne Autumn.
Not until Cheyenne Autumn. So, Ben didn't have any trouble finding work, but,
Well, he went back to rodeoing in that time.
He became the national rodeo champion. He's the only guy in the world that has an Oscar and the national rodeo championship belt buckle on his mantle.
And he deserved them both.
The
relationship, again, with your grandfather and Duke, the mentor and
mentee.
Yes, mentee.
He was kind of like a Dutch uncle, he was sort of he was his rabbi, his teacher and an instructor. And, everybody, you've heard this before from people like Dobie Carey, when Duke directed, he was worse. Dobie Carey would always say, geez, on the Alamo, Duke's worse than Jack Ford, that mean son of a bitch,
I heard nobody was worse than Jack Ford.
So anyway, that's what they all said. So.
You worked at NBC quite a long time too. What was your function there?
I had started in television. I worked at KCBS, KNXT, and a couple other stations. And I worked local news at KNBC, and then I got the Tonight Show, and worked on the Tonight Show, the Carson Show.
What was that like?
It was the world's greatest part-time job because we didn't do a lot of production. We would do one production act per show, usually one musical act, and then once a week we'd do a sketch, which required some rehearsal. But really, it was a great opportunity. It was like having a Fulbright scholarship because it gave me time to write the book. Well, it was a great education, but I worked other places, and on weekends I did sports and travel.
At the Tonight Show, what were the rehearsals like? Did Johnny come out and participate in all of that?
He would, if it was a big name, Johnny would come down and say hello, and if it was a sketch, of course, Johnny would be there. But Johnny focused on the writers. Johnny didn't beat up the crew and the staff. He beat up the writers, and there was a lot of turnover in the writers. And Johnny was a comedian, and his push was on the writing and on the monologue particularly. And then and the second tier who got it were the bookers, and who can we get, or why can't we get this person, and so on. So I want to get John Wayne. John Wayne doesn't really need to plug anything, but if Wayne was friendly with the producers who did Laugh In, and
George Schlatter,
and if he was on the lot, he might do a walk-in.
I remember when Duke did dressed up as a pink bunny
Rebel
Easter.
he was friendly with Schlatter, and one time the best Tonight Show was Bob Hope, Bing Crosby did a walk-on, and then Duke did a walk-on. And George Gobel was sitting down at the end of the couch, and he said, "Do you ever feel like an old pair of brown shoes in a closet full of tuxedos?" That was one of the great shows.
celebrities always milling around. So during
We had a bar behind the set. We had a prop box, and it just did props, and you open it up, and it was a bar, So everybody who was a drinker would stop by, including half of management, and a crew from other shows. We weren't allowed to in there until the show was over. And but people the Schlatter liked to drink, and he'd come by, and Ed McMahon, of course, And then we'd hang around, and the musicians would hang around, particularly those that lived in the West Valley. In the summertime, when the sun was a certain way, they can drive into the sun, so everybody would hang out in the bar until the sun got to a certain point. That was a great gig for a musician, because they'd do a studio gig during the day, come do the Tonight Show, then go play in a club at night, And it was a great gig because it allowed them to keep their foot on a nickel, so to speak. It guaranteed a certain amount of income, and everything was extra. And most of them were good studio musicians who did a lot of stuff, scored a lot of films. Bob Bain, the guitarist, he did bum 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 bum. What was that? Peter Gunn, and real guitarists would come in, and they would, and real musicians would come in, and trumpet players would come in and do a little shtick with Snooky Young and some of those guys.
Where was a great band.
It was a good band, yeah.
Nothing.
It was well run, and everybody had a good sub who couldn't make it. If you couldn't make it, if you're on the road or you're doing a studio gig that ran over, they always had somebody that could call. It was just as good, or maybe not quite as good. You didn't want anybody who was better, but it was pretty much the same cast of characters. Henry Mancini, Bob Bain did a lot of Henry Mancini stuff.
Well, Mancini did one of the great John Wayne movies, Atari, with The Elephant Walk.
Oh, yeah. Good stuff, sure.
Of your grandfather's films, is there one or two that...
Well, I have to say The Searchers, or I'll get people to start throwing things at me.
I'd be the first.
You'd be the first, and you've asked me that before, and I'd said my favorite was They Were Expendable, and I got stuff thrown at me, and I got booed off the stage. So I'll say my favorite is Searchers, and then my second favorite is They Were Expendable, because I'm a boat guy, not a sailor.
Those are good choices, and you've been a good choice to come here today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you, Dan, for showing up and sharing these stories with us.
Okay, my pleasure.
With that, thanks.